Here we go. Here we are. Welcome, everybody. That would be Zoom. Welcome, everybody. My name is Veronica Wilson, and I am super excited to welcome everybody today. I know it is 2 o'clock right on the dot, but I know it's going to be a tight program, and people are going to be signing in as we're going, but I just want to do my spiel first so that we can get over to Andrew. I am the Outreach and Events Liaison here at Idea Exchange. We are incredibly excited to have you. As I was saying, the chat room and the Q&A will be open throughout the whole program, so please do use them. For those who are watching on YouTube, the chat room is there. I will make sure to bring over any of the comments or any answers or any questions, and I will bring them over to Andrew, and we will make sure to get to as many as we can possibly get to. I know there's always lots of questions at these talks, so we will do our utmost to get to as many as we can. If you're having any technical problems, message me on the chat and I will help you out as well, and have fun. And I will pass the virtual floor over to Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you, Veronica. Welcome, everyone. I'm super excited today. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. I think something that's super cool. We're going to be talking about kelp. And kelp's pretty amazing because not only does it help out ocean ecosystems and some of the amazing animals that live in the ocean, but it also can be used to solve a lot of the problems that we have in the world. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. But before we start, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Andrew, and I'm an educator from Ocean Wise. And today I'm joining you from Vancouver, British Columbia, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Peoples. And so I'm really privileged to be joining you today from these lands. And it's pretty amazing because just outside my window, I can actually see it from where I'm sitting, is the ocean. And these beautiful ecosystems that actually have a lot of kelp and a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today in these ecosystems. And the indigenous people that have been living on the land that I'm on since time immemorial have been living with the animals and the ecosystems and the kelp forests for thousands and thousands of years. And there are so many things that we can learn from them about how we can use kelp, how we can be better stewards of the ocean environment, and maybe some ways that we can actually help kelp and help kelp help us, if that makes sense. So today we're going to be talking about what kelp is. We're going to be talking about how it can help ocean ecosystems and how it can help us. But before we begin, I would like to hear some of your thoughts on what the largest threats that are facing our oceans currently today. So maybe you can say in the chat, just list 1 or 2 of the larger threats that you think face our oceans. Awesome, we have trash and pollution for sure. We've got plastic, that's a huge, huge problem. There's so much plastic, there's about a dump truck of plastic that ends up in the ocean every minute. What are another couple threats that we have that might be facing our oceans? Yeah, we have overfishing. So we have a lot of problem with fish stocks. So maybe we're taking too much fish out of the ocean and we're not giving them enough time to regrow. And Carol Neal says warming seas as well. Absolutely. We have warming seas, partially due to our greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So these are all some really huge threats that are facing our oceans. And I think what's super cool and why I'm here and so excited to talk about kelp is kelp actually provides some solutions that can help with a lot of these big ocean threats. So I said I'm joining you from Ocean Wise, which is a conservation organization. And we focus on 3 of the biggest threats that currently face our oceans. So we're focusing on climate change, ocean pollution, and overfishing. And within these huge ocean threats, we have some smaller conservation initiatives that try to tackle a lot of these smaller issues. So we look at whales and plastics and the Arctic. And one of our newest initiatives is called Seaforestation, which is pretty cool. So Seaforestation is the act of restoring, planting, managing, and caring for underwater seaweed forests. So you can kind of think of it like reforestation, but in the ocean, in the sea. And basically, it's using either kelp forest restoration or maybe cultivation, which means farming. So like growing seaweed for consumption or for other things. maybe like carbon sequestration, which we'll talk about today. But I've said the word seaweed and kelp a few times now. But what actually is seaweed? Well, seaweed are macroscopic, so they're very large, algae that grow in the ocean. So they're marine algae. And there are three different types of seaweeds. There's green seaweed over here. And that's a lot of the stuff that we eat and we know very well because it's kind of our classic idea of what seaweed is. There's also red algae, which is the one right behind it. And that's actually used in a couple really cool products that we'll talk about later. And then over here is our final type of seaweed. That's brown algae. And that's what we know as kelp. So kelp just refers to this large brown algae. And my friends, seaweed is super special because it does something really cool. It photosynthesizes. Can you think about what photosynthesis means? Does anyone know another organism that photosynthesizes? Can you maybe type that in the chat for me? What else photosynthesizes? Now, photosynthesis means that something uses the energy from the sun directly to grow as food. So we go to the grocery store or we get our food and we eat it. Whereas other things like trees and kelp and algae uses the energy from the sun to grow. And so what happens in photosynthesis is kelp takes in and absorbs the sun's energy, but it also absorbs CO2, so carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out. And so it absorbs that CO2 and that energy from the sun, and then it breathes out, but it actually breathes out oxygen. So it's pretty cool. It takes in that energy, takes in that carbon dioxide, and releases oxygen into the water or into the air, depending on if it's the trees or algae. So my friends, we have a couple true or false questions. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the program, but some of you may have some bingo sheets called Kelp Bingo. And so feel free to follow along with your Kelp Bingo sheets if you have them. Try to fill in all of the answers. And if you're in a classroom and you get bingo, just raise your hand nicely because there will still be some really cool information and we don't want to be too super distracted. But my friends, if you don't have a bingo sheet, you can just follow along and learn all of these cool facts that we'll be talking about today. So my friends, I have a question for you. Kelp is a type of plant. Is that true or false? I want you to vote in your classrooms. You can put your thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false, or you can pop that in the chat. Is kelp a type of plant? I just said it photosynthesizes, but this is hard because it might be something a little bit different from a plant. You have 5 more seconds to get your final answers in. 4, 3, 2, 1. And the answer is actually false. So this is a tricky question because while kelp use the same way of getting their energy as plants do, kelp are actually algae and not plants. They're a type of marine algae, and they have different structures and different makeups than plants do. All right, time for the next question. Kelp can grow over 30 centimeters per day. True or false? Can kelp grow up to 30 centimeters in a day? That's about the length of a ruler or about a foot if you're joining us from the States. All right, I'll give you about 5 more seconds to get your guesses in. Is that true or false? All right, and the answer is true. So there is a certain type of kelp that we call giant kelp or macrocystis that can grow up to 30 centimeters in a day. So that's a pretty amazing amount if you think about how much carbon it is taking in to grow, and all that carbon is going into the tissue that turns into that plant, or sorry, that kelp. All right, final true or false question, my friends. Kelp holds on to rocks with roots. Is that true or false? This is also a hard question. Does kelp use roots to hold on to the rocks? All right, we've got a couple guesses in. I'll give you 5 more seconds here. The answer is actually False. So kelp uses something we call a holdfast. So it's kind of looks like roots, but the main difference is the holdfast job is to grab on and hold on, but it doesn't actually uptake nutrients. So if you think about trees and plants, they use the roots to get nutrients from the soil, whereas this kelp just uses that holdfast to hold on tight so it doesn't get carried away by currents. Now, my friends, we've talked about what kelp is, but how does it benefit ocean ecosystems? Well, kelp is actually basically the foundation of some of the most beautiful ocean ecosystems we have off of the coast of British Columbia. So you might recognize some of the animals on here, like the killer whale and the sea otter, but kelp forms the bottom. So because it can take energy from the sun, it is the base of that ecosystem. It's the food that things like crabs and sea urchins and sometimes fish, they eat that kelp, and that food, that sunlight and that carbon goes up through the food chain all the way to the top to killer whales and to otters and even to people like us, like me. I'm still here in part of the food web because I eat salmon, sometimes eat herring. And my friends, kelp provides some pretty amazing things for the animals in this food web. So you can think of kelp like the trees of the ocean. For example, it provides habitat and shelter for herring, which is a really important type of fish that lives in British Columbia. And these herring, they actually lay their eggs on the fronds, so onto that kelp. And it's really important because it's a safe place for that herring to lay their eggs. And those eggs provide the next generation of herring, but they also provide food for hundreds and thousands of different animals, like grizzly bears and black bears and birds and sea lions. They all come when the herring spawn. My friends, one other animal that benefits off of living in a kelp forest is the sea otter. Now, the sea otter is super cute, and what they actually do is when the sea otter mother is going hunting, it will leave its baby up at the surface of the ocean, and it'll tie it up in some kelp fronds so the baby doesn't float away. So it's kind of like leaving your kid in daycare, but instead of daycare, it's just some kelp that takes care of that baby while the mother's out hunting. Awesome, my friends. Now, there's one other really cool thing that kelp does that helps one of the biggest issues that our ocean is facing, and that is ocean acidification. So what is ocean acidification? Ocean acidification is when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from things like fossil fuels. So for when us driving our cars, from big industries, from oil burning, when there's more CO2 in that atmosphere, it also means that the ocean absorbs a lot of that carbon. So it means that there's more CO2 in the ocean as well. And when there's more CO2 in the ocean, the acidity in the ocean increases. So if you think about the acidity of the ocean sits around the pH, which is how we measure acidity. It sits around 7.5 to 8. So it's pretty in the middle. But when there's more carbon dioxide in the ocean, that pH goes down because the acidity is going up. So you can think about it as the ocean is becoming a bit more like lemon juice. And this is bad because in the ocean, acidity and things like shells, the shells that sea snails and moon snails build their homes out of, or clams and mussels or scallops, their shells don't like acidic things. So I have a shell here to show you. This is a scallop shell, and it's made of something we call calcium carbonate. And that's what makes this shell. It protects the organism that lives inside of it. And what happens is when you put calcium carbonate into something acidic, what do you think happens? If we're adding acidity onto a shell, does anyone know what happens to that shell? You can maybe guess in the chat, but I have a bit of a demonstration. Right here, I have a little Tums. And Tums is actually made out of the same things that shells are, or at least part of it. It's made out of calcium carbonate. And I right here have some vinegar. So when we put this Tums, which represents our shell, it's a little sad because it's going into vinegar. When we put it into that vinegar, let's see what happens. Oh, so if you can see there, it might be a little hard to see, but it's bubbling and slowly dissolving in that vinegar. So this process will take a little bit a while. So I'm going to put it aside for a while and we'll go back to that at the end. But this is a sped up version of what would actually happen in the ocean. So I have on the next slide a quick picture. Oh, no, I don't, apparently. So what kelp can do, though, and what makes kelp super cool, is it actually helps to reduce the acidity in the ocean. So it helps to buffer that ocean acidification. And so if you see this kelp on the left here, it's absorbing that carbon dioxide and making oxygen. And in that process, it's actually decreasing the acidity of the water around it. So kelp can help protect the animals with shells and the other animals that are sensitive to that ocean acidification. Now, my friends, how can kelp benefit humans as well? And this is my favorite part because this is the super interesting stuff that Ocean Wise is working on. Kelp has been used by Indigenous people on the coast of British Columbia since time immemorial. It's a really useful tool. It can be made into fishing gear. It can be made into lines, and it can be made into rope. It can also be used to store ingredients inside. Because if you see here, this is bull kelp, and that's actually a hollow bulb on the top, and that helps that kelp float in the ocean. And so if you chop that in half, it's a really good way of storing things like oil, like ulican grease, which is a type of grease that's found from a fish. That's really important. But basically, kelp has been used and is deeply ingrained in the food systems and the culture of many of the coastal Indigenous people here. But did you know that you might already use seaweed almost every day as well? I think that's pretty cool. So it's your job to guess which of these items uses seaweed as an ingredient. Are you ready? True or false? Does ice cream have seaweed in it? You want to guess in the chat. Do you think that the ice cream that you eat and the ice cream that you might love to eat during the summer has seaweed as an ingredient? I'll give you a couple seconds to guess. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The answer is true. Ice cream actually has something, it's derived. It's an ingredient that is made from seaweed, actually from this red seaweed that's behind me, that helps to bind that ice cream together. So it helps to make the texture of that ice cream. So that's pretty cool. Ice cream has some seaweed as an ingredient. What about sunscreen? Do you think there is seaweed in sunscreen as well? True or false? Oh, we've got a couple trues. Awesome. We've got a few falses. The answer is true as well. So there is some kelp depends on what type of sunscreen, but it also does help with holding it together. Because if you think about sunscreen, it gets a bit runny. And kelp is a natural ingredient that helps to bind liquids together. All right, our final question. Does toothpaste contain seaweed? True or false? Or yes or no? We've got a couple guesses coming in. We've got false, false. I'll give you a couple more seconds to get your final guesses. Well, you might dislike me for this, but the answer is actually true as well. These all contain seaweed as an ingredient, very similar compounds that all help to bind that together. And so seaweed's used in a lot of things, from ice cream, sunscreen, toothpaste, to also to makeup and cosmetics, as well as in many different foods. So my friends, let's watch a quick video about some of the amazing ways that kelp can help us with some of the larger issues. It's not just an ingredient we put in some things. It can help us out with some really cool things. I'm just sharing my screen here. And so I will play this video.
underwater forest, seaweed, are an extraordinary resource because they take CO2 out of the water to turn it into tissue. Tons and tons and tons of tissue that grow rapidly, that grow 30 times faster than terrestrial forests. Massive carbon drawdown is the greatest benefit that I see from seaweed expansion.
We cannot wait to change the world. We have to start now. We have a way to heal the planet. It's by starting with the oceans.
The problem is we're adding way too much carbon way too fast, so our ocean is getting overfilled with carbon. You know, when we're talking about global warming, we're not just talking about the air, we're talking about the temperature in the ocean increasing. But what we're trying to do is figure out how to take this kelp, make food so you can feed people, make agricultural products which you feed to your farm animals, fertilizer which you can feed to your plants.
Cattle, they produce a compound called methane, one of the biggest contributors of greenhouse gases. Some people think it's more than transportation itself. Feeding seaweed to cattle can actually reduce these emissions by up to 90%. If we could farm enough seaweed and feed it to the cattle, they'll produce less methane, therefore better for the environment.
We at Ocean Wise believe that we can play a role in ensuring that the industry receives the best possible scientific guidance on how to maximize environmental returns, where to place their farms so that carbon sequestration is maximized, where to place their farms so that fisheries benefit, and how to carry out an operation that is safe and produce a product that is safe for everybody.
This is it. Seaweed farming can change the world.
Awesome. So there were many different points in that video, but some of the cool ones we've already talked about. We've talked about how seaweed can help buffer ocean acidification, how it is used in many things. It's a superfood, how seaweed provides habitat for many different animals in that ocean. But there were a couple things in there that we haven't touched on yet, and how seaweed can help combat climate change. So this is one of the big things that Ocean Wise is looking into, is seaweed's ability, as we said, to absorb that carbon in the process of photosynthesis. It grows so quickly and absorbs so much carbon. And one of the things that happens is, naturally, some seaweed breaks off dirt from storms or when it's the end of that algae's life and is carried out to sea. And so that seaweed floats because of it needs that buoyancy for the bull kelp thing that we saw. And basically that seaweed can float out to sea, out into the deep, distant ocean. And eventually, those kelp pieces will lose their buoyancy and float to the bottom. And when the seaweed ends up on the bottom of the ocean, it actually gets stored. It gets buried in marine sediment, so like sand in the deep ocean. And a lot of the carbon that was in those tissues gets locked away in that ocean sediment. And so it's actually estimated that 11% of the carbon that was stored in the kelp tissues gets locked away and stored and is naturally sequestered in that ocean sediment. So we're looking into how much of a promise it is that seaweed can help us store carbon for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the ocean. And my friends, seaweed can also be used for many other things that can help us combat climate change and things like ocean plastics. So for example, in the video, it said that if we feed seaweed to cows, this is an ongoing experiment, but it seems from the preliminary studies that feeding certain types of algae to cattle can help reduce their methane emissions, which are also very harmful greenhouse gases. We can take seaweed and make it into bioplastics. So we can use it to make plastics that biodegrade. And so instead of breaking up into tiny pieces and ending up in the ocean, we can make plastics that naturally compost. We can use it as a type of food. So we can use seaweed as a superfood. We can add it. It can help us with food security, which is going to be a big thing in the future. And finally, we can use it as biofuel. So you can actually turn seaweed into something you can burn with your car or your motorcycle. instead of gasoline. Now, my friends, I'm running out of time here. But my question for you is, how can we help kelp? So what kind of things that can we do to help kelp help us with all these different issues in the world? So the first one that we can do is try to eat a bit more kelp. If you live on the coast, you can try to buy some kelp that's sourced locally. Or if you live in places like Ontario, which I think most of you are joining us from, you can incorporate more seaweed and more kelp into your diet. Because as we create markets for that, it means that there's more room for us to grow and to continue pursuing seaweed as a solution. We can also talk to our government representatives about how important it is for us to explore what we call nature-based climate change solutions. So things like planting trees, planting seaweed, these are all really amazing ways that we can help combat climate change while also contributing to ocean ecosystems and healthy nature and biodiversity. And finally, my friends, the last thing that we can do is just share what we learned today and share some of the cool things that we learned with our friends and family to spread the word that there are some really, really cool things that we can do with seaweed and kelp. And while it might seem kind of slimy and gross, it actually has a lot of solutions to many of our world issues. So my friends, I'm going to wrap it up there, but thank you for listening. And please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to pop those in the Q&A is, I think, the best way. If you're joining us from YouTube Live, I think Veronica is going to help bring some of the questions to me. So yeah, we'll open the floor for some questions now. Awesome. We have our first question, which is a fantastic question. If you harvest seaweed, does the carbon it's storing get released into the atmosphere? And so the short answer is if you harvest it and you use it as a food, or if you use it for a product, most of that carbon does go back into the atmosphere. So just growing a bunch of seaweed and then eating it all isn't a very good way of sequestering that carbon. But a lot of the things that we're looking at is how we can grow seaweed and then take a chunk of that seaweed that we've grown and sink it, or lock it away in other products. So you can actually take that seaweed and that kelp and make it into things that, like concrete and cement, that will lock away that carbon for a long time. So there's many ways of still cultivating seaweed and farming it, but still getting some of that carbon sequestration. Awesome. Are there any seaweed farms on Canadian coastlines? That's a great question. So our seaweed industry on Canadian coastlines is in its more infancy stages. It's actually picking up in the last 5 to 10 years. So there's beginning to be some farms. And a lot of the seaweed that's still taken is wild harvested. So it's taken from nature in small quantities. So it's not harming the seaweed for us. But there is more of a push for farming in local areas, which is really amazing because seaweed farms, if they're done properly, can develop really positive environmental benefits if they're managed really well. So you can actually create ecosystems for fish, especially if you leave a bit of that seaweed. You can help with ocean acidification, and you can create a really interesting market for this seaweed and potentially make it into things like bioplastics. Oh, we've got an awesome question. What can be done about seafloor dredging? So guess one of the main things like trawling and other fishing practices that harm the seafloor. One of the main things that we can do is some of the work that Ocean Wise does, and what you might recognize us for, is our sustainable seafood program. And so one of the things that the sustainable seafood program looks at is what type of fishing and what type of fishing practices are used in order to get the fish. And so trawling and like deep sea trawling, where they pull a net across the bottom of the ocean, is not very sustainable because it can wreck that seafloor and it can wreck the benthic environments down there. And so what happens is if we try to buy sustainable seafood and we try to make sure that these fishing practices are regulated, that's a really good way of stopping things like deep seafloor trawling. All right, our next question is, can only certain types of seaweed be planted here and not in other warmer climates? That's a really good question. And I think the short answer is in the ocean, yes. There's a limitation on what we can plant, especially because we don't want to introduce invasive species. So that's something that the governments and a lot of the seaweed farmers are very aware of is that introducing species from other places is usually a bad idea in really harmful or very delicate environments. But we're lucky enough that a lot of the seaweed species that grow usually grow in similar latitudes. So if you think about in Japan, they're on a slightly similar kind of latitude to us. And a lot of the seaweeds that grow there could be grown here. We still have to deal with the invasive species thing. But there's also the possibility to grow a lot of the warmer weather seaweeds on land. So we can grow them in aquaculture farms on land in big tanks of water instead of growing them directly in the colder oceans.
I think that's it from YouTube. I don't know if there's anything. We're actually out of time too. It's 2:30. I knew this would be an interesting topic and the questions would be coming because it's just so fascinating. It's something that I've never heard about until I found your website. You hear about a whole bunch of other ways that we can help the environment. Oh, there's another one. I'll let, if you, are you okay if answering one more question?
Yeah, I can answer one more for sure. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Perfect.
There's so many things to cover and so little time, but
I know.
I'm happy that people have really interesting questions. These have been some great questions.
That's awesome.
Will denser kelp beds be detrimental to other sea life? That's also a really interesting question. So it really depends on how dense. The good thing about kelp forests is usually they reach a point of density where they just won't be able to compete with each other. If you think about a forest, you can only have so many trees in a certain area of land before some of them start to die off. So we're kind of, the idea of kelp restoration is to restore seaweed forests back to where they were before our industries and our basically dumping of chemical and toxic waste into the ocean kind of damaged those kelp forests. So we've actually seen a huge degradation of global kelp forests in the last 25 years, if not more than that, because we haven't taken data past a lot of that time. So that's a really cool way that we can actually use indigenous knowledge and use kind of that historical knowledge of understanding how much kelp there was before and how much we should plant in order to get those ocean ecosystems maybe back to a place that they were pre-industrialization.
That's amazing. I am so glad that I was able to find you and that we were able to bring you in virtually. It's one of the upsides of everything that's happened because then we've been able to bring people in from all over the world. It's Calgary, right? I believe. Yeah.
From Vancouver.
Vancouver. You're from, I think Toby's from Calgary, I believe.
Toby's from Calgary. Yeah.
There we go. We would never have been able to do this. So thank you. For everybody who's joining us, I will be sending out an email. It has the Ocean Wise website. I highly recommend going over and checking out their website. It's got so much information. It's got videos and resources, and it's fascinating. You're going to get lost. I promise you. There's just a whole bunch of wonderful things on that website. I also sent a link out for next week's Fun with Friends. We're going to the Toronto Zoo to explore the African savanna. So going from wet to very dry. And I hope that we can have you back virtually again with us. Because there's just so much to talk about. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us. And thank you, everybody out in the virtual world for taking part in today's program.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Veronica. Thanks for having us on here. And thank you all for your great questions. And I hope you learned some really cool things.
Awesome. All right. Bye for now, everybody.